It's the weekend, so I'll be blunt. In my prediction, in the coming days or weeks, Keir Starmer and the UK's communications regulator, OFCOM, are going to get their backsides handed to them by American company 4chan and its lawyers, and maybe even Donald Trump and JD Vance, and it will create an international fiasco, which is going to be very embarrassing, I'm very afraid to say. I don't make this video to be disrespectful, I am just telling the truth as it is, and this is utterly absurd. If you've missed it, Ofcom, the UK's regulator, purports to fine 4chan, which is a website run by an American company with no actual business in the UK, no assets in the UK and so on. It's purely an American company running a website in America, and they purport to fine them £20,000 for failure to comply or contravention of UK laws. They also say that there's a requirement that they will comply and take immediate steps to comply with our laws, which contained within these notices, and in the event of non-compliance, a daily penalty of £100. You can probably guess the response that this has garnered from the lawyers for 4chan, which is all divulged here from Preston Byrne, with whom I've been in touch. So you can actually see all of the documents on here. He's put them all available to download in the interest of transparency. So let's talk about this for a minute. Now, if you value free speech, please do subscribe to my channel here. I am, as you know, a champion of free speech, and we really do need to protect it because, quite frankly, and again, I don't mean this to be disrespectful, but it has to be said quite bluntly, I think this is absolutely, utterly absurd. I think the UK has as much chance of extracting a fine out of North Korea as it does out of a US company for breach of UK laws in regard to free speech, which is protected under the First Amendment in the United States, which is absolutely the gold standard of protection of free speech. Now, let's go to what Preston Byrne discusses here. He says, below is relevant enforcement correspondence sent by the UK Office of Communications, Ofcom, in relation to 4chan, the website, and its Online Safety Act fines, disclosed publicly in the interest of transparency and because the First Amendment allows it. Civil rights are like non-rollover vacation days. Use them or lose them. And I absolutely agree with that. We have to use free speech to protect free speech, because the minute you don't protect it, it erodes away that little bit here and there. And before you know it, you're having people being thrown in prison just for saying something the government doesn't like. Now, we can't have that. So Preston Byrne, along with co-counsel Ron Coleman, Preston is representing them pro bono here, and says as follows, that 4chan operates its business entirely lawfully in the United States with exactly zero regulatory paperwork required. Zero as in none. All of the paperwork called for in the letters from Ofcom is what the UK expects every internet company in the world that hasn't geo-blocked the entire island to maintain and file. Every demand it expects everyone to comply with. Now, I've looked through these documents, and it's absolutely true. Let's go to the Online Safety Act here, because this so broadly sets out that the duty under the Online Safety Act, which has been a fairly controversial piece of legislation, purports to include any company worldwide who extends the service by design or operation and use the service in the United Kingdom, and in the case of a duty that is expressed to apply in relation to users of a service, the design, operation and use of the service as it affects United Kingdom users of the service, and thus sets out a duty in this legislation which, quote, must be complied with in relation to any user-to-user service. So to put that in English so that you can understand how absurd this is, the UK legislation expects any company worldwide to comply with a duty under this act as it relates to the design and operation of their service in the UK, or in relation to the use of its service by people in the UK. So if it doesn't comply with all of the duties, they fine them. And so, as I say, in theory, any company in any country worldwide, including North Korea, so you can understand how absurd this is, if its services are available and used by people in the UK, this legislation requires them to comply with the duty under the Online Safety Act and thus would be liable to fines by Ofcom if they fail to comply. Now, as I said, it is just as likely to be complied with by North Korea as it is the United States. Let's read on. So Preston Byrne talks about the somewhat contradictory and fairly ironic findings by Ofcom here. And so this is an extract from the full confirmation decision by Ofcom, which has certain highlights by Preston Byrne to literally highlight the points that are so absurd here. So among Ofcom's findings, it says, for the reasons set out below, we find that 4chan, the American website, is a provider of a regulated user-to-user service within the meaning of the Act. And as such, it is subject to the duties set out in the Act, including 102.8. More about that later. 4chan.org references 4chan Community Support LLC as being the owner of the copyright 4chan, and so both contact and legal areas of the site. Therefore, 4chan is the provider of the website, just for legal purposes. So it's a US LLC providing services via a US website. At 4.3, it says, we note 4chan's submission that Ofcom does not have jurisdiction to take enforcement action under the Act, on the grounds that American businesses are protected from enforcement of UK legislation by the First Amendment, and that Ofcom has no power to enforce UK laws in the US. Ofcom then says at 4.4, we do not accept this point. Now, I'll pause before I'll give you Ofcom's justification for that in paragraph 4.4, but I will tell you that from a matter of jurisdictional law, I think that 4chan and its lawyers are correct here, because in order for this to be enforced in the US, there would have to be an enforcement agreement. Thus, they would have to have, firstly, an equivalent law in the US that backs up the law in the UK, and they'd have to have the agreement of the local jurisdiction, the local court, the local district court in the US, or even a federal court. But then they would have to have agreement of enforcement to enforce those laws, which are otherwise protected by the First Amendment. Now, coming back to this, to reiterate the point, American businesses 4chan says American businesses are protected from enforcement of UK legislation by the First Amendment, and that Ofcom has no power to enforce it. Ofcom says we don't accept this point. The Act explicitly grants Ofcom the legal authority to regulate online safety for individuals in the UK, and this expressly includes conducting investigations into the imposing penalties for non-compliance by providers of online services within the duties under the Act. In particular, Section 1.1 of the Act sets out the purpose of the Act, which is to provide for new regulatory framework which has the general purpose of making the use of internet services regulated by this Act safer for individuals in the UK. They then say that the Act expressly anticipates that it will have extraterritorial effect, stating in Section 204 of the Act, references in this Act to an internet service, a user-to-user service, or a search service included such service provided from outside of the United Kingdom, as well as a service provided from within, obviously. So essentially, Ofcom is saying, which the legislation states, which it does, because this is Section 204, and it says that references in this Act to an internet service include services provided from outside the UK, and the power to require the production of documents by an information notice includes outside of the UK. The power conferred by Section 106 includes the power to require the attendance for an interview of an individual who is outside of the UK. And so they are saying that despite the First Amendment protection of free speech in the United States, that this law requires those companies to comply with this law, to produce documents, to attend for interview, and even requirements enforceable in civil proceedings against a person apply whether or not the person is in the UK. Now, to put it bluntly, this is utterly absurd. There is no chance in hell, in my view, of any court in the United States, much less Donald Trump and his administration, allowing the erosion in any way whatsoever of the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, which protects free speech, particularly when you look at it. So if you've never seen it, this is the wording of the First Amendment of the United States. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peacefully to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. This is as plain as day. The US Constitution will protect free speech. That doesn't mean there aren't defamation laws and all sorts of things. There are consequences within the United States, within the framework of US law, but it will not, in my view, allow any other foreign jurisdiction, including the UK, to erode the First Amendment of the Constitution in any way whatsoever. However, I did say there was a huge lump of irony with all this, because despite in Ofcom's correspondence saying they don't, quote, don't accept this point with reference to the First Amendment of the United States, Ofcom then purports to reserve its rights under US law as follows. Preston Byrne writes, in addition to claiming that US law is an irrelevancy when 4chan seeks to rely on it, Ofcom claims that its rights under US law are fully reserved when Ofcom needs to rely on it, namely in the lawsuit 4chan and Kiwi Farms brought against Ofcom in the DC Federal District Court, seeking nothing more than confirmation from a US judge that Ofcom's orders were void on US soil and an injunction blocking their enforcement here. Ofcom then writes at 311, Ofcom fully reserves all of its rights in relation to the complaint under all applicable laws, including but not limited to its right to object to the jurisdiction of the US District Court for the District of Columbia on the basis of sovereign immunity, lack of subject matter jurisdiction, lack of personal jurisdiction, or any other applicable ground. It would not be appropriate for us to address the claims made under US laws here, and we do not consider it necessary for the purposes of making our decisions. So it discounts US law for a US company running a US website, under the Constitution no less, but reserves all of its rights on the basis of sovereign immunity, lack of subject matter jurisdiction, and lack of personal jurisdiction, which is a little bit odd to me. Now, just to explain the subtext of that complaint is at the footnote 27 here. In summary, 4chan is seeking a declaratory judgment that, firstly, Ofcom's attempts to serve documentation are invalid for failure to comply with the US-UK Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty or other legal process, and secondly, Ofcom's orders and demands are unenforceable in the United States on the grounds that they are inconsistent with the First, Fourth, and Fifth Amendments to the United States Constitution, the Speech Act, the Communications Decency Act, and US public policy. And if that wasn't bad enough, all of this seeks to undermine what Keir Starmer himself, as the UK Prime Minister, said to President Trump and Vice President Vance to their faces in the White House, that the UK would not seek to reach across US citizens. And we don't, he said. His own words, word for word. Watch this.
In his remarks at the Munich Security Conference, Vice President Vance condemned free speech violations in the UK, particularly. Could you respond? What is your message?
I have an idea. We have the man right here. Come on. Let's go, JD. We're putting you on stage.
Great. Yeah, look, I said what I said, which is that we do have, of course, a special relationship with our friends in the UK and also with some of our European allies, but we also know that there have been infringements on free speech that actually affect not just the British, of course, what the British do in their own country is up to them, but also affect American technology companies and by extension American citizens. So that is something that we'll talk about today at lunch.
We've had free speech for a very, very long time in the United Kingdom, and it will last for a very, very long time. Well, no, I mean, certainly we wouldn't want to reach across US citizens, and we don't, and that's absolutely right. But in relation to free speech in the UK, I'm very proud of our history there.
And whilst it could be argued that the UK trying to protect the UK and UK users from everybody else outside is congruent with Keir Starmer saying that we wouldn't want to reach across US citizens, well, there will be US citizens in the UK, living in the UK and accessing those services from the UK. And some of them living here for a long time, some of them living here temporarily, or regardless, whatever. But either way you look at it, the UK legislation, as it is drafted here, expressly provides for extraterritorial application, which says that the UK can fine a company in any other country if the service is applicable and accessible to users in the United Kingdom, which, again, to put it bluntly, is frankly absurd. I agree with the premise that the UK wants to protect its citizens from terrible stuff online. And all of this, you'll note that I have not talked about what is on the website 4chan. And it's irrelevant. That's because it's irrelevant what's on it. Now, it's only irrelevant in so much as that the free speech element in the US protects their ability to publish whatever they want on their websites. it is open to the UK to block it, and the only alternative is for the UK to physically block websites that its government decides that its citizens shouldn't see, which many might see as government overreach. Many might agree with it, and, to protect children and so on. But at the end of the day, this is a free speech argument, and it is an international jurisdictional thing whereby the UK is just not going to succeed in fining a US company. It's going to make the UK look a little bit silly. I'm sorry to say it, but that is my view, and it's just not going to happen. But anyway, let me know your views in the comments below. Please do subscribe to the channel, I always ask, and thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one.